Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this Digital Leaders Week session. We really appreciate everyone joining and taking the time out of your schedule, and we hope you'll find this webinar both helpful and insightful. I see the participant list is continuing to grow, so we're going to kick off anyway, but hopefully everyone can continue to join. So my name is Ange Bishop. I'm Head of Solutions here at ThoughtWorks UK, and I'm going to be your moderator today. I'm joined by Melanie Mitchell and Ian Cartwright, also from ThoughtWorks, who will introduce themselves in just a moment. For those who are less familiar with ThoughtWorks, we're a global software consultancy with over 7,000 people across 14 countries. We work extensively across the public sector in the UK and also commercial companies. So just a couple of housekeeping items before we begin. Everyone is muted, but you can submit questions at any time through the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll be addressing those questions at the end of the presentation. We're recording the session today and we'll be sharing that with you all following this live event. Over to you, Mel and Ian.
Thanks, Ange. Hi, everyone. I'm Melanie Mitchell. I'm a delivery principal for ThoughtWorks, and I've been here for 10 years now. I've worked across multiple countries. I work across multiple sectors, but I typically specialize in enterprise transformation, and that typically means legacy replacement. Ian?
I'm Ian Cartwright. I'm a technical director for ThoughtWorks. I've been with the company 18 years now. A lot of what I work on is very similar to Mel. I'm also part of the group that puts together the ThoughtWorks Technology Radar that we publish twice a year. Okay, so a quick introduction. So what we're going to be talking about today is really a more holistic approach to legacy replacement. So one of the things we often see and that we both run into is that organizations often treat legacy replacement as primarily a technology issue. And one of the challenges with that is when you've had a system for a long time, the actual business processes and the ways of working that interact with that technology become shaped by it, maybe because of bug fixes or workarounds. And so actually trying to treat it just as an IT problem can cause a lot of issues. What we also find is that when people are looking at ways of working and business processes, they don't sort of trace that down through into the legacy system. So often these systems end up serving many different parts of the business, supporting many different types of business processes. But when people try and document their as-is ways of working, they sort of end up with one area of the diagram that here be dragons, this is the mainframe or this is the big legacy. And they don't sort of follow that down and see where the data ends up or where the data is coming from. So it really means that you don't have the whole picture if you try and treat legacy replacement as just an IT problem. So what we're going to do quickly today is take you through a few things that we found useful, probably also a few things to avoid. And then, as we said, there'll be some time for Q&A at the end.
Thanks, Ian. So in terms of one of the things to avoid, certainly this is one of the lessons that I've learned, and I see clients making this mistake over and over again, and that's feature parity. So feature parity is a trap. I find sometimes when you have not very engaged leadership or people who, stakeholders who don't really understand customers, it's an easy answer to simply rebuild everything that you already have. Unfortunately, this is a recipe for driving away end users, because what happens is that you get nothing new for 18, 24 months, and then you end up with exactly what you had previously from the end user perspective. So it's important that you understand the business context and you really focus on what's actually needed today. So legacy systems have evolved based on past needs and a lot of history, but if you're going to rebuild, you need to focus on the problem that you're solving today. A recommendation is that you do a lot of upfront work on the analysis and the metrics so that when you're going into replacement, you're having conversations about prioritization and you're challenging stakeholders, that you have real data that can feed into your decision making. That way you won't migrate or rebuild if it doesn't make you money, if it doesn't provide concrete value to your customers. And you can't lose sight of the fact that revenue is usually obscured or lost in legacy situations, so you're going to have to go and do a fair bit of digging. Related to this, you're also going to really need to focus on managing expectations. So it's quite a common thing that we hear. We can't possibly give them fewer features. We hear that a lot from stakeholders and people in leadership, but it's very rare that we actually hear that from real customers. We do it this way now, so that's a very common thing to hear, but of course that's just not good enough. That's not a reason for spending the money to rebuild. And then I don't retrain my staff. It's kind of a funny one, and it's obviously not a good reason for spending money, but it's something that comes up, right? So avoid feature parity. Rebuilding the exact same system you have is almost always the wrong answer, and it's going to cost you money. Next slide, Ian. Hard truths. So this is quite related to the first slide. It's important that you step into difficult conversations and that you speak the hard truths. You need to have these hard conversations between IT and the business to ensure that you have real alignment and a shared understanding of what your real challenges are going to be. Sometimes clients are unprepared for how much harder it is to do legacy replacement versus greenfield work. So for example, if you've always demonstrated progress by visible feature delivery, you're going to have to reset stakeholder expectations. The sunken cost fallacy. So the sunken cost fallacy is when we continue in action because of our past decisions, whether that's time, money, or resources, rather than choosing to take a rational choice based on what's going to maximize your utility today. So the longer this continues, the harder it is to reverse, and certainly the more money this is going to cost you. So there is a strong emotional reaction as you may have to write off your existing system. And people may have spent their entire careers, depending on how old the system is, they may have spent their entire careers on the system, or they may have spent their entire careers working in the tech that your system's based on. So the unspoken secret of many successful legacy replacement projects is that they're actually not replacement projects at all. You're taking a new approach, a new mindset, and the result is likely to be different than what you have right now. So you're probably looking at something that's more transformational than simply a replacement. So you need to step into the hard conversations. Legacy replacement can be more emotional than you might think because of the organizational change that's going to need to come with it. Ian?
Okay. So as Mel mentioned that she talked about changing how you work. So when we get involved in these sorts of projects, one of the things we often see, one of the sort of key pillars of the business case, the justification for doing the work is to try and cut the cost of change and make change faster, because those are some of the challenges we often see with the legacy system. Is small changes are now taking too long and they've become far too expensive. And that's something the business wants. So maybe instead of getting one release a year or every 2 years, they actually want to see some stuff happening every 2 weeks, every 4 weeks, something like that. But there's a problem here. What a lot of organizations do is they use the same approach to building the replacement for the legacy system as they've been using to get where they are today. In other words, they're doing very big upfront as-is map of all the current business processes, which I've seen actually people take over 2 years to do that, and then they'll do a massive, great big plan off the back of that to deliver all the work. And then at the end, they might have a big, scary, big bang release where everybody crosses their fingers and hopes that things are going to work. And unfortunately, usually things don't work out. The other thing that's very common is these projects actually never get to completion. Either because by the time they've finished mapping out all the current business processes, the business has already moved on and needs something different, or they just stall in the implementation phase because, again, things are moving and they just can't keep up with that moving target. So really, what you have to do when you're building a replacement is you say, we need to build it how we want to carry on. So in other words, if you want regular releases every few weeks or every few months, then build the new system doing that from the start. There isn't any way to sort of magically build something as some sort of waterfall project for 18, 24 months and then flick a switch and go from one release every 2 years and then suddenly you're doing every 2 weeks. It just doesn't work that way. Also, you've not had any practice. So build things incrementally and do regular releases right from the very beginning. Now, obviously, this has some implications, and it also brings some challenges, both technically and from a business perspective. But we do think that it is better to deal with that complexity and deal with those challenges than leave it all to the end and have a huge amount of risk piling up on the end of the project. So think of replacement, legacy replacement, as actually, it's not an end state. It's not something that's going to be done. What we're doing is saying, let's find a new way of working and build our new system in that way.
Old wine in a new bottle is just another name for the illusion of progress. So this can usually happen for a couple of reasons where, you know, from a positive perspective, we've had customers have a real commitment to the customer experience. You know, they're really focused on ensuring that the usability of their product is very strong. But sometimes this leads to an overemphasis on the front end. Another reason for this might be cultural issues or internal politics, where actually you focus on visible results because you want to demonstrate progress, but then that means that you're not really focusing on holistic change. So it's important that when you're thinking about demonstrating progress, that it is not just front-end centric. I did have a client one time that had a very strong culture of being customer centric, but because they really overemphasized the flashy design, it hit a lack of improvements in the back end. So everything up front was really shiny and new, but actually it was kind of the same garbage under the covers. The performance and stability issues continued. But unfortunately, the stakeholders assumed that because the changes that they could see, you know, they could see a lot of good change, it was making good progress. They assumed that those changes also were in the back end as well. And that simply wasn't true. So you have to be careful here about how you demonstrate progress and how as an organization you reward shiny new features. So you have to have a holistic approach to improvement, but you also need to be really transparent about what real progress looks like and the pace at which real progress is going to happen.
Okay, so talking about sort of changes in the back end, one of the main challenges, and actually unfortunately something that often gets missed, is if we've got a system that's been around for 10, 20 years, maybe longer, over time you'll have accumulated a large amount of data. Maybe even some of that data came from the previous system that the current one was a replacement for. So you've had imports from other systems, the software's changed over time, maybe even there's been data privacy law changes, or there's been different behavior from the software around the quality of the data over time. So what that means that when we look at a system that's been accumulating data for 10, 15 years, you almost always have a data quality problem. And it needs to be faced into and acknowledged. And one of the challenges we often see is people don't do that. They assume that, well, we'll just migrate the data to the new database. There's some sort of one-off activity. And normally what happens is they start the migration, get, you know, a few hours in and it blows up because there's a referential integrity, or we've broken the rules. And why haven't these addresses got postcodes? You know, why don't these customers have dates of birth? Those sorts of things come up. So there's a big reset, a big scramble, and then you try it again, and then it fails, and so on. So it's really important that migrating data out of legacy systems is always going to involve data cleansing. It's not just a one-off weekend activity. So the other thing that it can bring, though, is that's actually can be a huge amount of work. That can be a lot of work to do to get on top of all of that issue. So how do we make that work with a more incremental way of delivering? Well, one approach is actually to say, let's try and slice the problem up in a way that we can just migrate the data we need as we release that new functionality in the new system. So let's only move across the data we need when we need it. And then also we can put some testing around that. And we can try also to put that data in the form we need it in today, rather than copying across existing data structures. Because if we just copy the existing data structures across, they're often a cause of the delay and the high cost of change, because, you know, there's maybe a column that now has, you know, if the first letter in that column is an A, then it means something And if the column first letter is Z, then we have to interpret the rest of the characters in some other way. And so all those compromises, we don't want those to make their way into the new system. Now, sometimes when I talk about this, people say, well, that's throwaway work, that's a waste of money, let's not bother. But for me, one of the ways I think about this is when say if you're building a dam on a river, one of the first things you have to do is build the channel to divert the river temporarily so we can build the dam safely without all the water flowing through the middle of it. And then when we finish the dam, we can, when we're all happy that everything's working and everything is as it should be, we can close that channel off and then fill it in. The same with like scaffolding on a building. So I think the idea of doing work that we then take away later, it's not waste, it's actually about making an investment to manage our level of risk. And I think that's also one of the challenges and one of the traps I've seen people fall into. They're like, oh, that seems like so much extra work, let's not bother, let's just do a one-off migration at the end. And it doesn't work. You know, if you want to mitigate risk, you have to be able to, you have to be willing to make some investment and spend some time to do that. Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about is the other very common pillar of the business case. We talked about, you know, faster change, cheaper change. The other one is there's almost always something in there around cutting operational costs by turning off the old system. You know, maybe we won't have to pay the license fees anymore. We won't be paying for all the bug fixes. Maybe even we're going to save a load of money because we can turn some hardware off and get rid of one of our old data centers. I had one client who had a large building in the middle of a city that was there, and it had just had one machine, and that machine was so old no one dared turn it off or move it. And yet they had to keep the lease on the whole building because of that situation. So there's always operational savings. However, there's a whole load of studies which show that, you know, 75% of legacy replacement projects, by this measure, they fail. They don't turn off the old system. And what's interesting is quite often everyone quietly forgets what was in the business case. Let's not talk about what was in the business case. But they get stuck. And one of the reasons they get stuck is they run out of money, or things are just taking too long because they've got this huge waterfall big bang release. They run out of time and money, and so they don't get all the functionality off there. But the other thing that often happens is, as we heard about early on, sometimes there's a stakeholder or a group of users who say, well, we're not moving to the new system. We'll stay on the old system, thank you very much, because we don't want to have to do dual working, or we don't have to do retraining, or whatever it might be. And that can be very difficult. But one way to try and address this is to try and get some of the measures and the metrics more visible. So this could be quite controversial, but at one organization I saw, there was one department who wouldn't move. So they said, right, well, you can pay, you're the only ones left, so you can pay the £2.5 million a year to keep that system on. And strangely, at that point, they suddenly said, well, no, actually, you know, maybe we can move to the new system, maybe we can engage and move our users across after all. And I mean, that may sound silly, but unfortunately, a lot of organizations, there's this huge bucket of operational costs, especially on legacy systems, where it's quite hard to track where we're actually spending. And then the departments or the parts of the organization using that functionality never see that cost. So the true cost of providing the services is often hidden. We'll maybe only see the cost of the office space or the cost of the salaries, but the cost of the IT infrastructure to support all of that becomes hidden. So this is really important. And like I say, you know, if you're not turning it off, you're probably not hitting your business case and you haven't succeeded. So watch out for this, and this is so common. We see so many organizations who have these old systems with just one or two processes left on them, business processes left on them. They're just being supported just for that. Okay. So the next thing I want to discuss as a challenge to look out for is when we're doing these replacement projects, we're not usually doing absolutely everything all in one go. And that would probably be quite a risky thing to do. Also, you know, there might be a system that, yeah, it's been around for a few years, but it's reliable. It's not costing too much to run it. We don't need to change it very often. So maybe now isn't the time to be replacing that. Let's leave that one for later. The trap here is when you've got all these legacy systems that your replacement needs to connect to and integrate with, we can take advantage of our knowledge. We know how the data is stored in there. We know where the data is. We know maybe some stored procedures we could call, or whatever it might be. And so there's this real temptation to take advantage of all that knowledge and just do some quick and simple integration directly down into those systems. The problem with this is, one, we've just made it much harder and more expensive to replace those systems because we've got yet another system that's deeply integrated. To use the architectural sort of terminology, we've created tight coupling. So what we want to do is try and avoid that. So a good way of doing that is really to avoid the temptation of relying on your knowledge of how they work and treat them as a black box. Put a facade in front of them, build a new API in front of them that hides the implementation. Make that API look like you want it to be in the future, not how it looks now. And then hopefully what we've done is put a bit of a fire break in there. You know. And of course, the other problem is if we're too tightly integrated, we can end up then coupled into their release schedules. We need to make them to make a change, but actually that change is going to implement us because we're relying directly on how they store the data in their database. So suddenly we're having to worry about someone who's still on that 6, 12, 18-month release cycle. So it really is something to be very careful of. Treat them as a black box and resist that temptation to take advantage of your knowledge.
So one potential solution that we want to just have a quick chat about is the new company strategy. So sometimes the organizational culture can actually really work against you when you have a legacy replacement program of work. Some of this is going to be really overt, like potentially politics, competing priorities amongst stakeholders. But some of it's actually just going to be really well-intentioned people that have been working in a particular way with a particular system for a very long time. So you want to increase your chances of success and avoid organizational antibodies by trying something like the new company strategy. So this means treating your whole initiative as a completely separate business or, a separate startup. It'll allow the team to focus on the profitable elements. It avoids constraining them with the organizational BS. But it can be really scary for organizations because this might be what you need to do to be successful. So once the initiative is stable and the new organization is demonstrating success, you could also move over people with the right appetite and the right potential for new ways of working or who really can add value. This will also help allay concerns knowing that later on there'll be a transition plan. So a client that I previously worked at, their organization was 50 years old. They had people in the business who had come right out of uni and spent their entire careers there, and they had a very strong culture. But when they were trying to, really innovate and do new things, they really felt it was going to be too hard to do it under the current structure. So they created a separate startup, and they actually created it in a whole new city. So they deliberately separated it from headquarters to ensure that it was just that much harder to influence the people in the new startup, or for people who are really interested and curious, it meant that they had less access. So if you need a radical way to drive change and ensure your program's successful, then consider creating a separate organization. It'll allow you to completely sidestep any of the challenges that you might see in your current organization. And then the last slide. So again, legacy is 50% tech and 50% process. So look at the challenge of legacy in the context of the areas of business it supports, build what the organization actually needs today, aggressively prioritize based on business value. And overall, you're much more likely to be successful if you take a holistic approach and rather than treating legacy replacement as just a technology problem. Thank you. And do we have any questions?
Thanks, Melanie, for sharing. We have got a couple of questions that have come through in the Q&A, so we'll go straight to those. Feel free, both of you, to answer them as they come in. So we've got a first one here. Are there situations where big bang replacement is the right approach? Either of you to answer is fine.
Well, why don't I go first? Because I feel like I have slightly less experience here. But I have worked at a number of organizations that strongly believed that, that they were special and that this was really the only approach for their customers and for their organization. And I've never seen it be successful. So I can't think of a situation, and certainly I haven't seen one in my experience. Ian?
Okay. Ian?
Yeah, I think I agree. And unfortunately, I've been in to sort of assess and help rescue programs for clients where they decided to push ahead with the Big Bang release, irrespective. At one organization, I actually interviewed everyone, all the sort of PMs who were reporting to the program manager, and I asked them all, how did you feel about this at the start? And every single one of them said, well, I knew it wasn't going to work. So I then had to go back to the program manager, and unfortunately they hadn't told him that. So that was a very awkward conversation, I think the real challenge is, if you think your only path to success is one that's enormously risky for the organization, then you have to look long and hard about what do you change about the organization to avoid that? What is it about your culture that's driving you to these incredibly risky decisions and risky ways of working? And go and fix that first.
Mm-hmm.
So if someone's saying Big Bang is the only approach, then first go and look beyond what your current problem is to the culture and your ways of working with the organization, and see if actually the real root cause of people saying that lies elsewhere.
Great, thanks both. Got another one coming in. So you recommend avoiding the feature parity trap, which sounds sensible. But what if the primary motivation for modernizing is technical? So i.e. it's the end of life for a legacy platform. And then a sort of slightly follow-on one, how would you engage users who aren't asking for this change or improvements to be made? Maybe Ian, you go first this one. Yeah, take that one.
Yeah, so I've been in exactly this situation. I think one is if you were replacing a system that a bunch of people use and supports a key part of your business, then there's no way you can view it as purely technical. One of the pillars of your business case might be technical, but the impact and the scope of doing that piece of work clearly isn't just technical. And I think the challenge will be that, and I've been in this situation where what often happens here is IT then sort of disappear into an IT huddle, say, hey, no change requests for the next 12 months, please, because we're busy doing important stuff. And the business get frustrated, and actually quite often they'll do what I call an end run around IT. In other words, they're like, well, we've got a competitor or we've got a change in regulation that we have to respond to. IT are down in the bunker doing stuff. And so they either sort of pay someone else to change the legacy system, or they commission a new system in parallel, and then suddenly we've made things far more complicated and messy. So I would be very careful to separate. The motivation might be technical. It might be to do with end of life, but go and find and engage, because I would guess 9 times out of 10 the end users really don't like that system, and there's lots of workarounds, so there's lots of problems for them as well. So try and address that as well, because if you don't, you will lose the business, they won't engage, and the risk is they'll go and find their own solutions.
Mel, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I thought that was a great answer. Thanks, Ian.
No worries. So we'll go on to a next question. We have one here. We have a slightly long one. How would you best deal with a situation where they don't know in detail what they currently have, but they know they need to change it? They know they have a system XYZ, but there's no accurate up-to-date diagrams, or bits of systems are in different people's heads. People are worried to touch parts of the systems they don't know. And maybe they don't have the source of code or documentation for some systems. So how would you best deal with that situation is the question.
Yeah, so I think I touched on this a little bit earlier, and this is really about, making that upfront investment. So you really do need to spend the time upfront to really dig into that. And I would approach this, from the business perspective about, what does the customers need? What are we serving our users from that perspective, understanding, and creating, the mapping and the diagrams to build that. So I think just because you don't have them and everything is quite dispersed, doesn't mean that that's not, that's immovable, right? Step into that, plan up front, decide that you're going to spend the time to understand that. If need be, maybe you need to do something around creating metrics so that you can get the real data around it. But yeah, I think that is a really good indication if you're in that situation. Then before you get to actually making changes and cutting code, you've got quite a bit of work ahead of you.
Yeah.
Ian, did you want to add anything? Yeah.
Yeah, I think obviously I would, we're talking there about gathering just enough information to start work. We're not saying necessarily gather all the information to replace the whole of the system. But this reminds me of a conversation I had with a client. A new CTO had come in and they were like, well, you know what? If we don't know what the current business processes are and we don't know how the current systems work, then that's no different from if we were just building this from scratch. So let's build it from scratch. And that was how they viewed it. They're like, if we don't have the information, yeah, we could go on a big archaeological expedition, especially, which is sometimes how looking at old code feels,
Mm-hmm.
And we can try and understand that, or we can just say, you know what, let's assume we have no information, have no data, and let's build the system we need today.
Great.
Because maybe that's a faster, less risky approach than trying to kid ourselves that we know how that assembler that was written 20 years ago, that everybody's retired and we haven't even got, kidding ourselves we know what that does. And is what you did 20 years ago really what you need today? Maybe.
Mm-hmm. So better look to the future, basically, when you're in that situation. Make sure you're getting what you need. Right, we have another one here about how do you balance the existing needs of users against delivering an incremental replacement system, i.e., the disruption caused by having to continue to use legacy at the same time as migrating workloads by strangling key functionality of the legacy and a cultural resistance of any working in a new way. Who wants to take that? Maybe
go ahead,
Ian. Or Ian?
Sure. Well, the short answer is very carefully.
Yeah.
But that doesn't really help. I do think this is absolutely vital, is to set expectations at the start. I think one of the challenges with these things is people realize too late, after they've started often, that they need to go and engage and talk with the end users. And that's too late. So the first thing you have to do is to go and engage and talk with them and say, how can we make this work for you? And just be open and honest to say there will be some parallel entry, there might be some parallel working, or we might have to split. Some of your colleagues are on the old system, some are on the new. But what this does touch upon is one of the biggest challenges with legacy replacement is how do you slice the problem up and so that you can deliver it incrementally, and finding the right slices. I think if you get that right, that's the biggest thing that will make you successful. But to find the right slices, that's not just, find a technical path that we can chop one part of the system off and re-implement it. It's also, where's a sensible place in a business process or among end users or colleagues where there's a handover point in the business process, or it goes from group A to group B, and using that also as part of the discussion on how to break the problem up. And I think one of the biggest challenges I see here is people slice the problem up based on technical boundaries, and that ends up suddenly someone is now in legacy, in new system, back into the legacy, back in the new system, back into legacy, because those technical slices turned what was a nice clean business process into lots of disparate chunks. So that's really important. It's back to this whole theme of understand the whole problem, be holistic in your approach.
Yep.
I just want to reiterate too, I think getting the users involved really allows you to be a lot more innovative when you're talking about how you could potentially cut these slices. So at a client that I was working at, the end users were actually internal employees. It wasn't customer facing necessarily. And as we were talking about how we were going to split things, it was an employee that had mentioned to us, actually, you know, we have a paper process that actually works. You know, we abandoned it quite a while ago, but we can actually potentially go back to pen and paper in a few spots. And that actually gave us a lot more room and a lot more space to think about how we were cutting these things. Because, you know, we tended to answer the solution from a more technical lens, but somebody's suggesting just a really cheap and easy workaround made cutting our solution a lot easier.
Great. I think we actually have a really other second question that's quite similar, which is around how do you actually balance or deal with providing business as usual access to legacy whilst that, you know, you're incrementally moving to the new platform, because actually, you know, their service can't be paused or turned off. I assume you kind of address that in quite a similar way, right? It's just about engaging those users and understanding where their boundaries are.
Yeah. I don't have anything else to add. I think that, yeah, it comes right back to the users.
And I think, I guess coming back to, you know, my little story about the diverting the river and the dam, actually sometimes one area where I've seen that question come up a lot is around data and analytics that's being used for dashboarding or reporting, and the need to keep that going. So you might actually have to build some sort of temporary solution that aggregates from legacy and from the new system as a first starting point, and then do your dashboarding off that new place. You know, so if you've got to keep the lights on with something like that, then maybe move that out, as we talked earlier, treat that current legacy as black box, put a facade, put an API on top of it, re-implement that key thing, that one key thing on top of that, and then we can start going. And then because the implementation is hidden behind that nice API, we can make it go to different places as we slowly then start to re-implement some of it. Well, not re-implement, I used the wrong word. Replace some of the legacy functionality.
Okay, thanks, Ian. Well, just a reminder to everyone, you can continue to put your questions in the chat as we're answering. We got another one here, again similar, but around capability. So the question is, designing a workable transition approach is a key piece of any modernization effort, as you've talked about. What skills do you need on the team that designs that approach? Mel, do you want to take that?
So I think certainly you need a strong perspective, like from the product, the business lens. So whether that is, you know, your product management, business analysis. There's another role that I've lost the words for. Sorry, it's gone. So I think the obvious things are, you know, from the technical perspective around architecture and having all the right technical folks in the room. I think where sometimes people lose sight of is having that real business focus, that deep understanding of customers, the person who's capable from a business perspective of hanging the whole system in their head so that you can really understand the impact of changes in one area and how those impact other areas.
So actually, I've been on a modernization program where actually we brought in, similar to what you're suggesting, actually some real, like, actual business people into the team permanently for the kind of 2 or so years of the program. And they were sort of there working with us to decide, like, if we're going to transition, what is the best way to do that for the business people affected, right? And it really helps us slice that system in a way that it, you know, is workable also for them, as well as technically as well, by having them really, really close to the team, not just someone that you kind of see as a stakeholder per se. So yeah, I see that. Ian, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, really quick. I think the one, I mean, there's quite a lot, but I think if you go into the mindset of you're building a new product, you're more likely to get the right selection of people. Certainly, again, thinking about where I've got called in to sort of help with things that have come off the rails a little bit. They had BAs, but business analysts, but they their way of working was writing huge documentation and then doing change management around the documentation, and that didn't work for the end users, because the end users were like having to raise change requests, and they didn't have any user experience people, because it's going to look like it does right now, right? So why would we need anybody who knows about user experience? And that they got into a very adversarial relationship with their end users, where there was this change board that everybody dreaded, because it just turned into this huge argument where all the business are coming with perfectly reasonable requests, but it wasn't in an enormous document that had been written 2 years ago. And of course, they were over time and over budget by that stage, that everybody was incredibly nervous. So people who can talk to end users, various flavors. I know that sounds like stating the obvious, but you'd be amazed how that gets missed.
Great. I think we're going to have this one last question, and then we'll probably wrap up for the day. So we have, being fluent in responding to immediate needs by users of systems are often affected if you purchase an off-the-shelf system. Therefore, doesn't help keeping up to date. And have you got any suggestions about how to approach this?
Ooh, you saved the big complicated question.
It's a lot.
So I think this is a long one. I'll try not to ramble because we're nearly on time. And the challenge here is often that people do these big requirements selection processes as a stage, and then they'll say, well, our big challenge is this thing is really expensive to run and to maintain. And then they make a leap and they say that it's expensive to run and maintain because it's a bespoke system. Oh, and we have all our requirements written down about how people currently use the system, so let's use that to drive a purchase of off the shelf. They sort of go into, and the real challenge there is understanding whether the real reason for high cost of change and change taking a long time are often cultural, and the way the organizations run and the way it's structured and the way budgets are handed out and things like that. And taking off the shelf and throwing that into that situation can often make things even worse, because now you've got a supplier and now you're telling everybody they have to work the way the system works. But if you don't do that, then you're customizing the heck out of that system, which means you'll get off the main support track really quick. So I think really what I'm saying is you have to go back and see if off the shelf is really the answer to your problems. Be very sure about that before you go into that, because that's a massive decision to make. And unfortunately, it's one where people make a lot of assumptions.
I guess particularly if you're buying the whole thing off the shelf, not just bits and pieces here and there. So yeah. Great. Well, I think that's all for today. Thank you to everyone who has joined us. If you have any additional questions, you can reach out to us. We'll be sharing the recording with you and also sharing some contact details. But thank you for your time and have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.